Turkey is attempting to step back into the spotlight as a mediator, pushing to revive the Istanbul negotiation process, claiming progress has already been made behind closed doors. But while Ankara promotes diplomacy, analysts warn these talks may not be about peace at all. Meanwhile, shocking reports suggest that a controversial US-Russia peace plan was drafted without Ukraine's presence, and the terms may go far beyond territorial concessions. From military restrictions to language policies and religious influence, the alleged deal raises more questions than answers. Ukrainian officials reject the proposal while Moscow cautiously says it is open to negotiations. Are new diplomatic channels emerging, or is this another geopolitical trap? Let's talk about it. Hello, this is Ukraine Today. Maria Farafonova here with the latest updates. President of Turkey Erdogan advocates resuming negotiations in Istanbul between Ukraine and Russia. In his view, these talks should be pragmatic and results-oriented, he said during a joint briefing with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. President of Turkey reminded that in May, negotiations between Ukraine and Russia were resumed in Istanbul for the first time in 3 years. According to Erdogan, 3 rounds of talks held in Istanbul this year achieved some progress, particularly on humanitarian issues.
The sides were able to directly discuss issues regarding a ceasefire, peace, and other military aspects. We view all these steps as valuable achievements. During today's talks, I also emphasized the need to continue the Istanbul process with a pragmatic and results-oriented approach.
According to the president of Turkey, as the exhausting consequences of the war for both sides continue to intensify, the Istanbul negotiations have become key milestones in efforts toward a diplomatic resolution of the conflict. He added the increases in attacks on energy infrastructure and accordingly the resulting human losses are causing irreversible destruction for both sides.
We believe it would be appropriate for the Istanbul process to resume with a broader scope and be directed towards solving problems that have already reached a critical stage.
He also expects constructive support for the Istanbul negotiation process from all partners in the region who seek to end the bloodshed. Some experts believe that discussions in Turkey are not about peace talks or a Kyiv-Moscow-Washington format. Instead, the negotiations in Turkey are seen as a meeting to assess how far Ankara and Erdogan can take on a further negotiation process. This viewpoint was expressed by diplomat Roman Besmertny.
Let me dismiss this right away. There are no negotiations that are moving forward, approaching, or explaining any peace talks with Russia, nor any Moscow-Kyiv-Washington triangle. In my view, this meeting, like the previous one you mentioned with the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, was about assessing to what extent Ankara and Recep Tayyip Erdogan can take on the further negotiation process. Note how in Washington, this issue moved into the hands of a trio, Rubio, Miller, and Vance. And recently, for the past 2 weeks, Fidan, the Turkish foreign minister, has been repeatedly saying that negotiations are intensifying, that they will happen, that the issue is being resolved, and so on. During the conversation, along with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Fidan, the foreign minister, the head of Turkey's Unified Intelligence Service, and Erdogan's foreign policy advisor also took part.
Roman Besmertny believes this is a working meeting to assess whether a negotiation process can begin at this stage and what its focus might be.
At the moment, there is only one track that is productive: the exchange of prisoners of war. Everything else is a dead-end situation. Everything circulating in the information space about Erdogan's role as an organizer and mediator of these negotiations is just good mental gymnastics, but far from being the substance of the current meeting in Ankara. And as I understand it, later this evening, there will likely be a press briefing or some form of press communication, and then we may learn some details about the role that Recep Tayyip Erdogan can play in the current processes. But to say that some negotiations are now about to begin, especially since people have already started talking about some supposed content, is very far from the reality of the meeting taking place today in Ankara.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Meanwhile, the United States and Russia have developed a peace plan behind Ukraine's back. But is it beneficial for Ukraine? Is Russia finally ready to make concessions, or will it once again demand them from the country it attacked? More on this in our report.
Peace is closer than ever before. The White House expects that a framework agreement to end the war between Russia and Ukraine will be reached by all parties by the end of the month and under the most favorable conditions, possibly even as early as this week, according to Politico. However, it is quite possible that such a peace will not satisfy either Ukraine or Europe and will only give Russia time to prepare for the next attack. According to Axios, citing anonymous sources, while a corruption scandal known as Mendichgate was raging in Ukraine and a political crisis was unfolding, the US and Russia prepared their own peace plan, secretly, not only from Zelensky's administration but also from their Western partners.
According to Axios sources, the 28 points of the plan can be divided into 4 categories: peace in Ukraine, security guarantees, security in Europe, and the future relations of the US with Russia and Ukraine. It is still unknown how the plan addresses contentious issues such as control over territories in eastern Ukraine, where Russian troops are gradually advancing but still control much less land than the Kremlin demands.
According to Axios, behind these nearly 30 points are meetings between Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Kremlin Envoy Kirill Dmitriev. Allegedly, the two of them held intensive negotiations in Miami at the end of October. Dmitriev himself confirmed this information to journalists and stated that in Moscow they feel that the Russian position has truly been heard.
Dmitriev told Axios that the main idea is to take the principles that Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed upon during their meeting in Alaska in August, and to develop proposals that would resolve the conflict in Ukraine, as well as restore US-Russia relations and address Russia's security concerns. It's actually a much broader framework that essentially raises the question of how to finally ensure lasting security in Europe, not just in Ukraine, he said.
What the Russians and the Americans agreed on remains a mystery. But both before and after the Putin-Trump meeting in Alaska, the Kremlin made no secret of its ambitions. There aren't even any differences from the original plan. In Moscow, they still want, and Lavrov has stated this openly, to control the government, the church, the media, and the status of the Russian language as a state language, as well as to achieve demilitarization and a non-aligned status.
There are 28 points grouped into 4 categories which are hidden behind rather favorable sounding names such as guarantees of security and stability in Europe. But what could Dmitriev and Witkoff possibly come up with? I think that's a rhetorical question. Apparently, the US really does believe that they are close to reaching some kind of agreement. But for us, it's important to understand that, as always, these agreements are being discussed without Ukraine, and as always, they are trying to present Ukraine with a fait accompli.
Politico and Reuters report that an American delegation has secretly arrived in Ukraine. Trump sent Dan Driscoll, the Secretary of the Army, to Kyiv, a friend of Vice President J.D. Vance from Yale Law School, who has become a key figure in the Pentagon. Allegedly, he will not only be interested in Ukrainian developments in the field of drones, but will also promote Trump's desire to announce the end of what is already his 9th war as soon as possible. A meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and the Americans is scheduled to take place after his return to Ukraine. On Wednesday, the president visited Ankara, where he planned to meet with Witkoff, but Witkoff cancelled his trip to Turkey. The plan of Witkoff and Dmitriev, which they are trying to persuade the Ukrainians to accept, is being actively discussed against the backdrop of a political crisis in Kyiv itself, with demands for ministers to resign and for a new government to be formed. Amid the potential redistribution of influence and portfolios, Russia once again launched a barbaric attack on Ukrainian cities. In Ternopil alone, the number of dead approached 30, and the number of injured was nearly 100.
A curious development: the new peace plan regarding Ukraine caught the US Congress off guard. Lawmakers say they learned most details from media reports. Pro-Ukraine members of Congress are alarmed by the significant concessions to Russia described in the plan.
I don't know what this 28-point plan is. It's good that we're even working on some kind of plan. I just heard about it, but haven't seen any details.
The details of the plan were also unknown to Republican Senator Pete Ricketts, a member of the Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Europe and Regional Security. Republican Congressman Don Bacon criticized the US administration for reportedly negotiating with the Russians without Ukrainian participation and seemingly pressuring Kyiv. This is reminiscent of Munich in 1938, he wrote on X, referring to the agreement widely considered a policy of appeasement toward Nazi Germany that ultimately encouraged Hitler to start World War II. The media have already analyzed the US peace plan, and it appears to include Russia paying rent for Donbass. What does that mean? Kyiv would relinquish control over the eastern Donbass region but retain legal ownership, while Russia would pay an undisclosed rental fee for de facto control of the territory. This was reported to The Telegraph by officials familiar with the deal.
In exchange for the territory, Moscow could pay a land fee to compensate for the financial losses incurred by Ukraine due to losing access to its land. Under its constitution, Ukraine is obliged to put any territorial transfer to a public vote, which would likely fail, something that could be avoided with a lease agreement.
However, the publication makes no mention of the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, which are particularly occupied by Russian forces and which Moscow has laid territorial claims to. There is also no mention of Crimea, which Russia occupied in 2014. As well as forcing Ukraine to surrender territory, the deal would slash the size of Kyiv's military in half and ban it from possessing long-range missiles. It would also block deployments of foreign troops in Ukraine and US military assistance and prevent foreign diplomatic aircraft from landing in the country. Russian would be made an official state language, and the Russian Orthodox Church would be given official status in the occupied territories. Officials in the Ukrainian capital dismissed the plan, and Russia denied knowledge of it. Donald Trump did not comment on the deal, but revealed that he had recently told Vladimir Putin, "Let me settle your freaking war." However, sources said the White House had told Volodymyr Zelensky he must agree to the terms, sensing weakness because of the corruption scandal engulfing the Ukrainian president. However, the publication does not specify what concessions Moscow is expected to make. Meanwhile, Moscow stated that it is open to negotiations regarding Ukraine, adding that it can arrange a phone call between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin if necessary. What do you think about the latest events? Share your opinion in the comments, like the video, and stay informed about the main headlines. More to come.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.